Yeah, so a consequentialist, like, how do we determine when a specific action or rule is moral, immoral? Well, we analyze and calculate the consequences of the actions. That's what we've been doing. That's what this is. That's what it means to calculate the consequences. A person does something, and then what would we have to do to make a determination, like after the fact? So say, well, let's do a future projection. This works for that too. So say that a person's that I am trying to decide whether or not to tell the one friend about the other, the other that's being unfaithful. Well, I could project the potential good consequences or positive consequences, as well as I can project the negative consequences. And then what I have to do if I'm making a future prediction is to assign sort of likelihoods or probability to it. To say, okay, what good could come out of this action? Well, I would, my conscience would be assuaged because it's bothering me, this reality of one being unfaithful to the other, so it kind of bothers me. Well, at least if I decide to tell or not tell, the decision's made. So, so at least that's some relief. Well, that's a plus on the benefit side. And then say that one of the friends might be thankful to have known. That would be a plus. That maybe the other unfaithful person was just looking for a way to actually tell the other person. They were looking for a way to leave the relationship. And so by me telling on them, that gives that person, say the friend breaks up with the cheater. And then that gives that person an easy out. So that may be a benefit. I mean, we're not trying to, be funny about this stuff. It's just like, this is realistic, so what you would need to do, according to consequentialism, is you have to tally all those possible benefits up. Figure out all the pluses. Then you also have to account for the losses. You have to say, okay, so how could this make me as the actor worse off? How could it make the first friend worse off? How could it make the second friend worse off? Then we put all those numbers, and if we can assign those numbers in a way, when we are thinking about the action, if our assignments look like it's going to come out like this, say that we see more benefit coming from the telling than we see overall losses, then we can predict that action would be moral. We can make a hypothesis like, if I were to do this, then it would be moral, given the projected consequences in terms of positive consequences and negative consequences. And so we can predict that action will be moral, but we also have to, what happens with these things when we're making a future prediction is you got a +9 and a -1. You would also need a probability score here. Like, it's 80% likely. And you would have to do this. I've just bundled them into +9 and -1, but you'd have to individually stretch all that out. Like, what is this first benefit point? And what is the likelihood of obtaining that single benefit point? Then what is the likelihood of obtaining that second benefit point? Is it 75%? Is it 90%? Is it 20%? And so you have another set of calculations behind this. For simplicity, I've just assigned them outright. Like this, you can assign these numbers with consequentialism after the action's done. And that's what it would look like. This is what happens after the action has already been done and we've tallied the the pros, cons to all these people. So we have numbers after it. But if you're doing this before and you're trying to decide, would this be a good action to do? Well, then you would try to assign these same points thinking ahead. But you also have to include the likelihood of each and every one of these points actually occurring. So the calculation gets more complex. It gets more, and probability is the likelihoods are always going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. So it's going to be some fraction. Always. And we don't have how it actually comes out until after it's done. So for making a prediction, we just have to, assign probabilities to each and every plus point we think will occur for this person or group of people. And every minus point. We have to account for all of that. So, like, the idea is, like, in this scenario, I said that, oh, yeah, and what if when you tell this friend about this one that was cheating, that you and that friend actually become the new couple? Well, how likely is that, really? It happens sometimes on television and movies, and it does happen sometimes in real life. But how likely is that to be the outcome of, you deciding to tell? You have to be honest about that with the consequentialist calculations. And that is what the consequence calculations are like. That's how they work. So, but that's how we determine. How do we, what is the morality or immorality of an action based on? Well, just how if once we do all those assignments of benefits and loss number assignments, we tally it up, and if the most people out of a group with its effect, the whole group that's affected by our action, if they benefited, the most people did, then it was a good action. If the most did not benefit, only the very few did, well, then it's a bad action. It is that simple. For consequentialists, anyway. Yeah, and so what you're doing, this is another way that I've already mentioned this. I always do the best for the most. You could say always do what's best for the whole, good of the whole. The way that works is if you do benefit the majority of a whole, like there's the whole, everybody affected by the action. If the majority benefits inside that whole, then you have done what was best for the whole. You looked out for the good of the whole. That's what that means. And if you think about that in a scenario like, say, that one person is sacrificed, like, say that we see this in movies and television, but it also happens in real life, where one person guards the retreat of all the other people. And so one person, is eaten by the monster or loses their life. But the other 10 escape due to that one person's sacrifice. And then if someone says, well, that person's there, and they say, well, was it a good thing for that one person to be lost? And you say, yes, that person sacrificed their life for the good of the whole. And so what that means is, well, that person was one of the whole, but everybody else in the whole benefited due to that one person's sacrifice. So by sacrificing him or herself, that person did look out for the overall good of the whole. The majority in the whole benefited. So anytime that the majority benefits overall from an action or decision, then what one could just as well say is that action did what was best for the whole. It looked after the good of the whole. That's how that notion relates to this. And so now comes the part that hopefully people have had this question in their mind. What exactly are these numbers, though? Like, we can kind of imagine. I mean, it is a person is able to imagine, things that we would consider to be better and worse consequences. Like, if we decide to take another job, leave our current job and take another job. Well, if that new job provides us with, say, 2 times the amount of money per year than the one we left was providing us with, then we consider making that much more money would be a very good thing in our lives. Well, then, yeah, that would be a plus. Yeah, we can imagine that. Or if I went from one job that pays tremendously well and say you get fired from that high-paid job and then you have to take a much, much lower-paid job, well, then you can see where the minus would be. So in terms of like money, resources, the plus minus, the benefits, the losses, like think in terms of accounting, your debits and your credits. Um, your debits are your loss, your credits are your plus. Um, that that makes sense with money. But what does this mean though with morality? Well, what is some of these numbers? What do they mean? Well, that's where consequentialism can become unique. Is that when it says, you look out, you do the best for the most. Well, what do we mean by the best? What do we mean by good for the whole? How are they defining that good and those plus minus things? Well, historically, and we will be, and you'll encounter some of these people in this week's textbook readings. There were consequentialists that are often referred to as utilitarians. They're still utilitarians that exist today. And what they interpreted those plus minus, those numbers to be things that Jeremy Bentham, which was one of the originators of this utilitarian idea. He wasn't the first, but who it's often associated with, is Jeremy Bentham. And that's about 250 so years back. What he talked about is those pluses and minuses were what he could call hedons. They could be pleasures and pains, where this is 10%, 10 pleasure points. This is 90 pain points. So this action gave this person 10 pleasure points, but it gave them 90 pain points. And so that means that this action caused more pain for this person than pleasure. That's one way to interpret those plus minus. If you're what's known as a hedonistic utilitarian, which very few people tend to be that anymore. But it was one of the original ways of trying to make sense of these plus minuses. 10 points pleasure, minus 90 is pain. Yeah. So then he called those things hedons. Or utiles. Sometimes you'll hear those numbers referred to as that. And what does that mean? Like sometimes you'll hear about utility, disutility. Well, utility just means positive benefit. Disutility means, well, a negative, a loss. But sometimes those plus minus is interpreted as pleasure, pain, or happiness and unhappiness. Flourishing, like one flourishes as a result of the consequences, like they experience a tremendous increase in pleasure, happiness, economic security. Like a person could think of flourishing. Anyone familiar with like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you're not familiar with it, it's a cool thing to look up. It's like a pyramid. This is often represented as a pyramid. It's a hierarchy of needs. Like our basic needs are like food, shelter, clothing, and then the next layer up is safety and security. And this is the kind of the bottom of the pyramid is what we have to have a hope of life. And then as you go up all the way to the top of the pyramid, like transcendence or self-actualization, that would be up here at flourishing. Like you've already achieved all. Like the consequences of some actions could be very high levels of self-actualization. Like a person could be really, really happy. They could feel like their life has finally come together. And in fact, maybe it did as a consequence of an action. But then there could also be despair, forlornness, all those nasty angst, anxiety. So whichever of those ways helps a person make sense of these numbers, you can use them, but you're never wrong to just consider it like this is a positive consequences. These were the negative consequences. These were the ones that a person would want. These were the ones the person would not want. You can keep it, just that simple. And now there is some interpretation though. In practice, we would have to do like they do with quality of life scores, like in medical fields, where a person goes over a series of questions with a patient, and then numbers are assigned based off of how that person answers it. Like, they try to do quality of life assessments, like post surgery or post like chemotherapy. We do, medicine does that. And, in some, depending on the scenario. So don't think that these things can't be quantified. They can. It's totally possible to assign numbers to whether something was positive or it was negative. But now the consequentialist has to be very careful about how those numbers are assigned, and it has to be a sort of vetted sort of test that that can be defended. It's like we have to kind of, like, for example, a person could be happy and sad at exactly the same time. Like, their sadness could be partially a result of their happiness, because maybe they don't think they deserve to be quite that happy. So you see, it gets tricky how to do these sort of point determinations in practice. But it could, science finds a way to quantify things if we think there's a true upside to doing that. And well, in this case, if the utilitarians, if we want to do it in terms of pleasure pain, that's fine. But I would say in terms of consequentialists as a whole, like, utilitarians are just one type of consequentialist. Most consequentialists always talk about it in terms of majority good, benefit, well-being, and just leave that kind of, loose enough to, if it happens to be a person received a lot of pleasure and then someone else received a lot of pain, fine, then that's the way they'll assign the numbers. But if it was more to do with happiness and unhappiness, then that's the way they'll define the numbers. So there's some weeble wobble there. There's wiggle room, which makes the theory good in that as long as it can be specified by the end of the calculation, it can be specified what we actually mean by those numbers. All should be well in principle. So that's what those numbers, that's what they actually mean. They could be beneficial consequences versus negative consequences, losses. Or we could be very precise about it and use like a medical diagnostic chart of, like, people may have seen these, like if they go into like a psychologist office sometimes, and they do it in other social science fields, where a person gets handed a sheet of paper and it says, circle the face that most represents how you feel today. And then it'll give you another line, circle the face that most represents how you felt yesterday. And then there'll actually be some numbers assigned behind the scenes to what each of those faces a patient is circling means. And then they use that in their numeric calculations to develop a treatment plan. Numbers are helpful. And so what are the core values, though, of consequentialists? Now that we got this idea, I feel like everyone by this time has got a sense of what always do the best for the most means. What are the core values of consequentialism? Well, utility, things that work out good for us, pleasure, happiness, well-being of the whole. The whole, the majority. That is what counts for consequentialism. It's not the individual. How an action directly impacts me is not as important for consequentialists as how the action affected everybody, how it benefited or hurt all the people affected by it. I'm just one member of the whole. If I'm the agent, I'm the actor. So, and all the agents all count as one and no more than one. So everybody in this bundle on consequentialism, I count as one. This guy counts as one. This person counts as 1. This one counts as 1. None of us have any preferential treatment when it comes to this assessment. These numbers are based solely off of how it actually impacted each of these people. It's not like this person's feelings matter more. Like, say, 2 people get the same. Like, this person had plus 75, that one had plus 75, minus 25, minus 25. It's not like this person over here, their plus 75 counts for more than this person's plus 75. No, those are equal. In terms of consequence, the outcomes, these people are perfectly equal in how they were affected by this action. Neither gets a preferential treatment. That's what it means for each of these to count as 1 and no more than 1. Same numerics for pros, cons, means same in terms of their role in it. These 2 people right here, their bar when it comes to the chart, the 75-25, where is it? Yeah, 75-25, they're indistinguishable. I don't know which is which. All I know is that one person's 75-25, another person's 75-25. Their bar and their score is the same. This one doesn't get more attention because this happens to be, say, a famous scientist, and this just happens to be, Joe the mechanic. That's irrelevant. If the results of this action were plus 75 for this person, plus 75 for this one, then as far as our calculation goes, these 2 people are just the same. Now, these could be different, though. These could be a different set of benefits that added up to 75 than the benefits that added up here. That's how these 2 people's occupation, their careers, their personal relationships, that's how they could differ into how they got up to these numbers. But in terms of the numbers, they don't differ at all. So all count as 1 and no more than 1. That's what I was just describing, that nobody gets preferential treatment. I mean, how the numbers fall out for people is how they fall out on consequentialism. And that's supposedly good. Why? Because that creates an objectivity. And so what do consequentialists value, though, too? Observability, quantifiability, testability, verifiability, confirmation. This is the thing to realize. I've kind of hinted at it all this time. Consequentialists are trying to make moral decision making more science-like. They are trying to make it more empirical. So all we have to do is action occurs, we count up the consequences in terms of benefits and losses, and however those numbers happen to come out, that's what we use to determine was it a good action, was it a bad action. We don't care what actually happened in terms of the action. We don't care what drove the person to do the action. Their motives, their intents, values, beliefs. What we care about is how it actually worked out for everybody affected by it. And if the most benefited, then it was good. If the most took a loss, then it was bad. And you see how that gives definitive answers. And that's what consequentialist is all about. Consequentialism is all about. Sometimes it's known as trying to create a science of morals or ethics. That's what their theory is essentially a first effort to do, is to take these notions of always do the best for the most. That's our guiding moral principle or imperative for consequentialism. The good of the whole matters more than anything else. That's their uber value or their supra value. That is their plus. Like if you think about moral objectivists, that's what consequentialists are, is they assume a form of moral objectivism. But instead of humanity and nature as being their plus, like their we plus, well, their little plus for consequentialism is like the good of the whole. And so all of our actions are compared and weighed and measured. We answer to what was best for the whole. And anytime we step out, we do something that more people take a hurt from us having done it than take a benefit from it, we've done something wrong. And anytime that more people benefit from our action than are harmed by it, we've done something right. You see how clean that is? I mean, it's super straightforward, and it can be observed. Like that's what consequentialists value. They value observability. We can actually see the results of our actions. Like we can see whether somebody has a broken leg after we acted versus before we acted. We can see that. We can see if a certain number of people die and they're dead after we acted than when they were alive before we acted. We can see that. So that's observability. I mean, it could also be, you can record things too, we can hear it, other things. And then quantifiability, yeah, I mean, consequentialists truly value that. That's what makes morality not like gushy squishy mishmash. It's like it forces one to try to quantify, assign numbers to. That's all quantify means, is assign some numbers to these benefits and losses. Like try to get a numeric representation of it. So how many, benefit points does one get for the happiness they feel after having done something? Well, of course, there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done to figure that out. And a lot of work has been done in the notion of scoring happiness, that one can look on the internet for the various scales of how people try to, like, they take an emotion like happiness and how they try to assign degrees to it, some numeric representation of just how happy one is. Because sometimes, happiness can seem like we can be more or less happy. And if you buy into that there are times when we could be more or less sad, more or less happy, more or less excited, more or less anxious, you're assuming a quantifiable scale could be placed on that. That's what consequentialists love. They value that. That's what their whole theory depends on, is that these things are able to assign some numbers to. And testability. They want to be, we can actually test this stuff. Like if we make a prediction about how the consequence numbers should come out before we act, we can make a hypothesis just like a scientist and say, if I were to do this, then this is the numbers I predict should happen. Well, I can actually make that prediction based off of probabilities and then actually collect the data after the action is performed and see how the actual numbers compare to the hypothesis numbers. And see how, we can graph that. We can chart it, we can graph it, we can do all kinds of statistical analysis. We can find the average, the standard deviation. We can find all of that stuff if we can quantify. Pros, cons, degrees of happiness, degrees of sadness. If that can be done, which consequentialists, assume that it can be, that's one of their default core values, is that it's good to be able to do this stuff and that in fact we can do it. It may not be easy, but that we can do it. That's what consequentialists assume. And that is what they value. Yeah, and then so individual well-being is important and will always be considered, but it ultimately counts as one and no more than one. What that means is, the actor, the agent, like me or you that acts, we get a score too. Yeah, but our score doesn't matter anymore in the overall calculation. Us having a score, a plus minus, just means we get a bar on this chart. It doesn't count. This bar doesn't count any more than that bar. What matters is how many bars are benefited versus how many bars are lost. So it doesn't matter. Everybody gets a bar, in this bar chart. This is a person. That's a person. This is a representation of benefits and loss that that person experienced as a result of an action. So everybody gets a bar, but no bar is more important than any other. We need all the bars in order to make a determination and say, oh yeah, 11 benefited and 6 lost out. So this action's good because more benefited than lost. Yeah, but the individual does matter. I mean, they get 1 bar, but everybody else gets 1 bar too. So individual, no one's special as far as these moral assessment go, And so that means consequentialists value impartiality, that we're not playing favorites with people. It's just a matter of how the plus minuses come out. And then their core value is the best for the most is what always morally matters most for consequentialism. That's their core value, and it is captured in that imperative. Always do the best for the most, and now we understand what that means. The best for the majority affected by an action. The majority of people, however that turns out, that's what matters to them the most. That's what morality hangs on. Did we do good by more people than we did bad for? If we did more good for more people than the bad we did for a few people, then the action's morally okay. That's how consequentialism works. And so they assume that that's good enough to determine the morality of an action. So what is their disvalues? What do consequentialists consider like extremely negative, not worth we don't want these things to show up when we're trying to do morality. Like we're trying to figure out how to assess the morality of actions. What don't we want to do? Well, selfishness, hardcore individuality. So consequentialist is immediately unfriendly to those who hold a moral subjectivist position. Remember, the moral subjectivist is that the meta-ethical position is that who judges the morality of my actions? Well, me and me alone. And so that implies that subjectivist considers themselves to be, his or herself to be really important. That they should get the only bar that matters for them, like on this bar chart, is their own bar. They don't care about all these other bars. They don't, unless they want to. They don't have to consider how those consequences played out for all these other people unless they want to. The subjectivist could take that into consideration, but they don't have to. Well, the consequentialist is going to say, no, in order to accurately determine the morality or, immorality of an action, we have to consider all the bars for all those people who were affected. Otherwise, we're not doing it right. Otherwise, just picking one's own bar and being like, well, I don't care about all these other people. I don't care how my action affected everybody else, so I don't have to. You see, a subjectivist could do that. Consequentialist is like, no. That's the exact opposite of what we should be doing as far as morality is concerned. And now, why do they think that? Well, that's just their assumption that morality is determined, their little plus is that best for the most. That is what we're held. This is the analog to nature being the judge, to humanity being the judge. For consequentialists, it's that imperative. That's always the judge. You always go to that, and it will tell you whether you did morally okay or not. Anytime you're concerned about, did I do the right thing or the wrong thing as far as ethics or morality is concerned, well, you just go to that and say, did I do the best for the most? And that's your judge. If you didn't if the consequences of your action did not result in the best positive benefits for the most people affected, if it did not result in that, then you acted immorally. Period. If it did result in the best for the most, then you acted morally. Period. That is their we plus. That is above and beyond any specific human group, any individual. It's objective in that it's something that our individual wants and whims. They get added into the calculation, but no single person's wants or desires or beliefs matter more than anybody else's. Whereas with a subjectivist, the individual values and beliefs and all that, and the subjectivist answers to him or herself and him or herself alone. Consequentialist would have us answer to this ideal or this moral principle or this moral imperative. We answer to who? We answer to the subjective thing that's out there, this we plus, namely that in order to be moral or immoral, we have to always do the best for the most. The consequences of our action have to be the best for the most. If they're not, then we didn't do well. We were bad. I know I've said this a lot, but it's a lot of different ways to say the same idea, but a person needs this familiarity to really understand consequentialism. So their core disvalues, consequentialism is going to always disvalue a subjectivist position. But they may be okay with moral relativists. They may be okay with other objectivists and absolutists, but only when those individuals or groups of individuals are willing to subserve their supergroup plus, which means, like humanity. Say that another moral objectivist wants to say, yeah, we ultimately answer to humanity. Consequentialists could get along with that person as long as by the notion of humanity, which a person would have to explain, what they really mean is looking out for the best for the most humans in any given action that we do. Consequentialists would be like, well, yeah, you're basically just saying the same thing we are. So they can certainly agree with someone just because they don't articulate what their judge or arbiter is in terms of consequences. If that's what they actually mean in practice, then consequentialists get along with them. Also, this notion of divine, like our absolutist sort of thing, consequentialists can get along with that as long as that person's divine, is a consequentialist. So I mean, it doesn't have to be that consequentialist is a moral objectivist position, but it can't get along with others. It's just that those others have to be willing to accept that, ultimately morality comes down to, did your action benefit the most? In any given case, did you look out for the good of the whole determines whether or not you did right or wrong. And so what would be the core disvalues? Well, of course, those things as well as harm to the whole. Consequentialist, the worst thing a person can do is choose to do something that results in the majority taking a negative hit from. So say that you have, this is where you get those cases of embezzlers, like someone that goes around and creates a whole bunch of fake policies and has a whole bunch of people buy those policies, and the creator, never intends for those people to pay. Like say it's a Ponzi scheme or something. And so you could have 10, 100,000 people affected by this, and the only person that really benefits from it is the scam artist. Yeah, the consequentialists could immediately say, yeah, that's wrong. You did the worst for the most. But now those consequences, remember, they don't judge. It's not wrong because it was a scam. It would be wrong if it makes the most worse off because of it. But if it benefits the most, like say that 10,000 people, they don't mind that they were scammed. They actually are glad that they were associated with this famous scam artist. Then there's, it may not be a bad action. It depends on not only how the people perceive the results, how it's the actual results. Like, did they actually get, what number of benefits, what number of losses? So they don't care about what the action was. The consequentialists don't. They don't care about what the motives for it were. If the scam artist intended to scam them and then in fact did scam them, but the result of the scamming was that in fact the majority benefited from it in some kind of way more than they lost, then the scam could be totally moral. This is how consequentialist is highly context sensitive. And we'll talk about that in the strengths. But the harm to the whole, harming the majority of people in any given whole is the worst thing you can do with consequentialists. That's when a person has acted as immorally as it's possible to be. To choose to do something or to do something that harms the majority of people or beings affected by that action, that's bad. Period. That's just bad according to the consequentialists. That's the evil thing to do. Yeah, and so any approach to morality of ethics that does not offer concretely testable outcomes, any theory that attempts to use feelings or intuitions or some beyond experimentation plus as the basis for determining when an action or rule is moral or immoral. Yeah, so consequentialists disvalue or they don't find worthwhile theories that try to base morality in terms of how people feel. Like to them that's so much the wrong way to go. If you say, okay, how do I decide whether this action's a good one or a bad one? Well, let me consult my inner feelings. If I feel okay about it, it don't matter how it turns out for all these people. If I feel okay with it, it's okay. Yeah, consequentialists are like, no. 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 Now, I'm not saying consequentialists, me, Stephen, is not saying that consequentialists are right or wrong about this assumption that morality should not be tied up with feelings and intuitions. We'll actually see next week with the deontologist that some of those do base morality determinations on intuitions, a very particular sort, but still that's what they're basing it on. And consequentialists, though, they don't like any non-empirically based ethical theory. For them, it's like, that's too gushy-squishy. I mean, how do we decide? People's feelings can be very erratic and stuff. And so it's not to say that the people's feelings don't matter and don't influence the way people act. Sure, they do. But when we're trying to determine did they act better or worse, do we really care about how they felt if we have 100 people impacted by this person's action and 99 are dead? Do we really care what that person felt like before that happened? Or do we really care that there's 99 dead people here? You see, that's the consequentialist. That number 99, we can count that. We see that. Whereas it's real hard to look in someone's mind and say, okay, yeah. That's the way consequentialists look at it. So the strengths, well, it inherits all of moral objectivism's strengths. So look back at last week's handout and video, and you'll see that moral objectivism has various strengths. Consequentialism, given that it is a form of moral objectivism, it gets all the strengths of moral objectivism. It also gets all of its weaknesses. You'll see that. But what is the good aspects of this theory? Excuse me. Well, it's simple in principle. It's that imperative. Always do the best for the most. As soon as we kind of know what that means, which we do by this point in the video, that what that means is whenever we do something, we always want the majority of people affected by that action to experience more benefit than loss. And if that doesn't happen, then we did something bad. If it does happen, we did something good. That's simple. I mean, it may now. Is it going to be simple to assign all those numbers? No, that's not simple. But the idea of consequentialism is very simple. And that's a strength. That's an advantage. It's if a person's offering a moral theory that's so convoluted and complex that we can't understand the basic idea of it, then that's not good. Not in terms of a theory. We should always be able to understand the basic part of a theory very clearly, cleanly, simply. Well, consequentialism is that simple. Always do the best for the most. Once you understand what that means, which by now you do, then you understand consequentialism. You understand the core, that 90% of what it is. That's good. It's got an intuitive appeal, actually. Best for the most seems realistic. Well, doesn't it? That how could it be wrong? This is the way the consequentialist would ask you anyway. How could it be wrong to ever do something that if I got 100 people, me as one of the 100, and I go into a room and I decide to do something, and 99 of us 100 benefit from it. How can that be wrong? I mean, doesn't that seem good? Or versus I go in a room and 99 have tremendous loss from it, and I'm the only one that benefits. Doesn't that seem wrong? How could that be right? It's like the intuitive appeal of consequentialism for many people is that it seems to capture that little core understanding that doing something that hurts a huge number of people and I'm the only one that stands to benefit from it just seems wrong, doesn't it? And doing something that tons and tons and tons of people benefit from and very few have negative impacts from, that seems right, doesn't it? That's the way intuitive appeal works. And you can decide that for yourself, whether you buy into that. It's impartial. That is a very significant strength of consequentialism. It doesn't have any biases, no prejudices. The only bias it has is it has to assume that we can assign numbers to benefits and losses, whether they're emotional, whether they're physical. It has to assume that. That's its only bias. It does not assign like gender, race, ethnicity, age, intellectual abilities, economic class, species membership. All of that's irrelevant. In terms of when we build our final bar chart, those numbers are gonna, that's it. Each gets one bar, no more than one bar. Now, could some of these factors influence the way the pluses and the minuses are assigned for an individual person? Well, sure they could. I mean, a person's age could determine how happy they were as a result of whatever an action was. And that can be factored in to assign, like a +1 or +2 or +10. But that's not being discriminatory or biased or prejudiced based on the age. No, it's using the age as a useful demographic, feature to inform what numbers to actually assign that are most relevant to that individual at a given time. But it's not used, but it's just used to get the numbers and to take into consideration the relevant data. It's never used though to make someone's ultimate bar be, where this person's bar counts more than that person's, benefit loss bar. No, it's like if this person benefited 75, this one benefits 75. It doesn't matter if this is a 100-year-old person and this is a 3-year-old. It doesn't matter if what race this person is or what race that one is. It doesn't matter what gender this person is, what gender that person is. Not when it comes down to the ultimate assessment. Doesn't matter at all. Those demographic features may be relevant to assigning the individual +1, -1s. And that may have to be taken into consideration, but that's no more offensive than it is when we do science. I mean, there's no prejudice, no relevant bias there. It's like if these factors are necessary to interpret a plus or a minus, fine. But when it comes to the overall assessment, none of those things matter. Everybody gets 1 bar. That's it. Objectivity. Yeah, it's what's known as an objective moral theory, in that it's based on the good of the whole, the best for the most. It's not based on what's Stephen. It's not. Ethics and morality don't turn on just what Stephen may want. Me. It doesn't turn on what just Bob may want. No, it turns on, or is founded on, this notion of doing the best by the most. So that's over and above our individual wants and whims. That's in the way in which consequentialism is objective. And it's that scientific quantitative approach too, where it's like that's what science does. It tries to eliminate out relevant bias, like tries to quarantine the variables so that we don't let in things like Bob is my neighbor and then Sally's my friend, and I don't really like Bob as much as I like Sally, so I'll care more about how my actions impact Sally than I do Bob. No, if it's me, Sally, and Bob in a room and I do something, however the pleasure law, the benefit loss numbers come out, I can't show preferential treatment to one or the other. I'm supposed to just accept the data, like the scientist is supposed to do. Just because the scientist may really, really, really want their prediction to be true, it may or may not be. It depends on how the numbers come out. Consequentialism is exactly the same. We may want to think that certain actions are right when in fact the numbers come back the other way, and then we have to be able to accept that, yeah, that's actually wrong. That's the way we're supposed to do it anyway. And it returns definitive answers, assuming you can tally up those numbers, assign them in some reasonable way, and do the calculations. Yeah, it gives you an answer. It tells you immediately, is it okay to tell one friend the other is cheating? If you can get the numbers right, it'll say yes or no. It doesn't. There's no wish-wash there. It's like yes, no. That's definitive. And consequentialism assumes that moral problems, dilemmas, there's no magic about this. Yeah, we just add up the outcomes, add them up, take into account the benefits, losses, and then we resolve the problem. If the most benefit from it, then it was good. If the most didn't, then, if the most were negatively impacted, it was bad. Solved. Instead of just swatting, just like aimlessly swatting at and hope for the best, sometimes that's what people do with ethics and morality. They're like, wow, there's no answers to those kind of questions, so I won't even bother. Consequentialism is like, no, sure there's answers. One just has to do the work to get to them, assigning the numbers, doing the calculations. But if you do that, sure, you can have answers. That's a strength of consequentialism. It's also flexible, extremely adaptable. I mentioned this earlier, that it can adapt to the most minute factors if they are relevant to assigning those benefits and losses. For example, it can matter whether somebody feels a certain way at a certain time. It can matter. But all that's going to turn into is a plus so many benefit points or a minus so many loss points. But it can adapt to changing circumstances. New factors arise. Well, we just have to reassign the number. We have to change, modify the numbers to account for those new, aspects of the situation. Extremely adaptable, just like science. It does not prejudge motives, values, or actions. Yeah, notice many of the examples we talked through in this video. Yeah, people default assume stealing's wrong. But remember, with consequentialism, it could be wrong or right just depending on how it turned out for the most people affected. So they don't prejudge that stealing is just bad. They don't do that. But now that means they also don't prejudge that murder is bad. They don't prejudge that being charitable is good either. They allow the consequences to determine whether such things are good or bad in a given situation. For them, they'll never be that lying is always wrong. No, they're going to say, okay, Bob lies to this group of people on this date and this time. What were the results for everyone involved, and what were the overall results for the majority? If Bob's lie benefited the majority more than it hurt, it benefited the majority, then it was okay to lie. If Bob's lie hurt the majority, then it was wrong to lie. So lying in and of itself, the action of lying is not prejudged by consequentialism. And they think that's the way it should be. That we don't care about why someone did something in terms of morality. We don't care what they did in terms of morality. What we care about is how what they did impacted everybody else that was impacted by it, the whole. And so they don't prejudge actions, values. It's like a person could value being very mean, and being mean, is often not thought to be a good thing. Consequentials are like, well, it depends on the situation. Let's do the number assignments and tally it up. If that person's value for meanness in this situation benefited the most, then it would be okay to be mean. If it hurt the most, then it was not okay to be mean in that situation. So each gets a fair hearing. There is no action that's just off the table. And then already, this is the one that's actually the neatest about consequentialism. It's already widely used. This way of thinking that I've described in this video, it's used every day. Where this is what's known as a cost benefits analysis. This is what, consequentialism is just that sort of analysis applied to morality, but it's applied to it, but it makes all the same assumptions that we can, tally up the benefits numerically. We can tally up the costs numerically. We can compare those across a whole range of people. And if the most got more benefit than cost, then that was the right thing to do. Yeah, that's how it's used in business and engineering. It's used the same way. It shows up in cases where, say, we could buy a more expensive little integrated circuit, and it would increase the overall durability or long-lasting aspect of a product. That it would increase it by, say, likely 3 to 10 years. Or we could buy this cheaper integrated circuit and put it in the product, and the longevity, that's I guess what would be a better word for it, the product longevity, how long it would actually function well might be reduced to just a few years. But there's a huge cost saving in going with the cheaper thing. And then there's also this reality that a person's probably not going to hold on to that item for over 2 to 3 years. And so, we're kind of in the throwaway world scenario where someone's going to throw it away anyway. So doesn't the overall benefit of saving all those dollars? And now some people are going to take a loss in that case. The person that does want to hold on to their little piece of technological thing for over 3 years, well, they're going to have a loss. But if the majority of people are going to toss it out anyway by the 2 years time, then it seems like the majority is going to actually benefit in the long run, because we will save all those people the money they would have had to spend if we had used that more expensive integrated circuit. So you see, that's how it could be a good decision to go with a cheaper piece to a device than a more expensive piece for that same device. And it'll have pros and cons, cost and benefits. and that can be assessed. Healthcare. This is done many times. I mean, think about like emergency situations, like triage, where you have a disaster, tons of people are in a hospital. A sort of default maneuver is for the medical staff to treat the people with injuries that can be quickly treated first. And then those who have longer injuries that could be far, far more severe than the people that have, these quickly treatable injuries, that if a person is going to take up an hour of a doctor or a surgeon's time during a disaster emergency situation versus this person is going to take up 5 minutes and the other one's 5 minutes, the other one's 5 minutes, well, that means you could see 12 folks in 1 hour versus that one that would have taken an hour of your time. Then, of course, you save the 12, and that one that's going to take an hour, they were severely injured, they may die in that hour before you get to them. But you take care of those who are savable in the quickest way. And then you go back to the one that was perhaps the most physical danger of dying. You get to them when you can. That has that consequentialist aspect to it. You do the best for the most in that case. Academic, yeah, things like this are done with it's done in academic and legal laws. Of course, laws are built to try to help the most people get along with each other, and it's a good law if it benefits the most. Typically, law enforcement, yeah, I mean, sometimes you may have to shoot one person, or that one person's gonna, kill 5 others, or they're erratic, they're running around endangering, 20 people in a room. So the police may shoot one person. Yeah, that's how those consequentialist calculations take place. Military, yeah, I mean, you send in 5 special forces people to try to rescue 50, POWs. But the idea is those 5 may not make it back out because they have to guard the exit of the other 50 getting out. So those 5 might not make it in order that the 50 will live and be rescued. And politicians use this with polling all the time. They look at the way the polls are, where's the majority consensus going? And then they want to do something. Typically, they want to tailor their message so that it will be perceived as benefiting the most. Because that gives them wider voter appeal. So this consequentialism, whether it's used in strictly moral or business or engineering or healthcare situations, there's a moral component, notice, to all of these situations I've described. But the idea is it appears everywhere. Just sort of do the best for the most, and you've done what was right. And if you did the worst for the most, you've done something wrong. Yeah, this is very, very common. The weaknesses. Well, it inherits all of moral objectivism's weaknesses. You can take a look at those from last week. Calculation problems. I've already hinted at this. Some people would wonder, how do you calculate all of these plus ones and minus ones? How do you do that? And and how do we narrow the consequences down to just those that really matter for everybody affected? Couldn't we get a bad case of the bloat? Like, do I have to consider when I get up in the morning to tie my shoes, do I have to consider how that may or may not impact a grasshopper later in the day? It could. I could trip and fall and my knee squishes a grasshopper because I tied my shoes poorly that morning. Well, do I have to really add that into the consequence calculation? If I do, how do I assign the pros and the cons to the grasshopper? Say that I don't kill it, it just loses a leg as my accident of tripping and falling. How do I assign a number for benefit or loss to the grasshopper? Do I need to contact, an insect person, whatever biologist style person that deals with insects? Do I have to get in touch with them to just say, to make a moral assessment about whether it was okay or not to tie my shoes? You see, that's the sort of case of the bloat and the irrelevant sort of consequences. That's how the objection tends to go. Like, really? How do you do that? And if you had to add all those numbers up and all those losses up, how would you even begin to do that? Well, consequentialists do have a reply to that. Namely, well, of course, you can't always get all of the consequences all tallied up perfectly before you actually act. But we've developed a sense of these things over time, and we can try to project the most relevant consequences for the majority. Now, once the actual results come out, it may turn out to be that we didn't account for some things that we should have. Well, that's okay. The consequences will just tell us we did badly. We thought we were doing okay. We predicted we would do okay, but it didn't. The majority was made worse off, so we did badly. I mean, that's all the consequences is going to say about these calculation problems is that, sure, I mean, it may not be possible to always be able to calculate every single consequence in terms of plus minus for every possible member of the majority, but we can certainly do estimates. And this is their response to calculation problems. We can absolutely do estimates, and that's good enough for science. Science can't calculate every single impact that might occur to a particular variable of interest. Of course it can't. But we can do reasonable estimates based on statistics, based on probability theory, on and on and on. So that's how they're going to respond to a calculation problem, but it is perceived as a weakness by some, and it is objected sometimes. The no rest objection is very similar to calculation, except like everything becomes a moral issue, like that well-being of that grasshopper. And if I got to spend all that time every day doing that, I'll never be able to sleep. Do I have to always be vigilant for every action I do and do the consequence calculations for every action? Well, technically, if you're what's known as an act consequentialist, yes, that's what you're supposed to do. But they know you're not going to. I mean, the idea is consequentialism is meant to be a helpful theoretical tool. It could always be applied, but it doesn't say you have to apply it for every single possible imaginable consequence of every action that you could ever possibly do. Of course, no one has time to do that. But the no rest objection kind of goes like, well, this is overwhelming, and consequentialists are just going to say, yeah, but sure, it's demanding. You have to use it at times if you want to know if you did morally okay or not. But there are a lot of cases where we're not really concerned about the morality of our actions. So you can rest. The no rest objection is there's never any time to rest. And consequentialist is like, well, yeah, there is. Take time to rest. There may be consequences from that. You may have done the wrong thing by resting, but we do have to live. Consequentialism is supposed to be a realistic theory where it captures something true about moral decision making. And so it has to be realistic. That's why it works in the business, the engineering, whatever world. Too permissive. Now, this actually could be a weakness for some people will reject consequentialism outright because it does not prejudge certain motives and actions. Like an example would be, say, rape. Consequentialists do not prejudge rape. They do not say rape is always bad. They say, no, rape is an action just like any other, and depending on whether the majority affected by it benefited or not, that determines whether a case of rape was morally okay or not. Just like theft, just like scams. None of that stuff is immediately considered to be bad. That means that consequentialists have to also consider things like, say, child molestation. Could there ever be a case where a majority of people benefited out of a group by that act? Some people are like, especially more absolutist, people who are more metaethically absolutist, will be like, that could never be a good thing. And the consequentialist it has to be committed to saying it may or may not be. We need to look at the outcomes and we need to look at the numbers. Then we decide on a case by case basis. Some people find that totally unacceptable. And if they find that unacceptable, well, consequentialism can't really say much to you at that point. A person either has to be open to the idea that every action has to be on the table for assessment. We can't pick and choose certain actions and pull them off because we already prejudge them. Consequentialists don't prejudge actions. So that may or may not be a weakness. It depends on it depends on what someone comes to consequentialism with, what their prejudgments are. Integrity objections. Yeah, these are interesting. There's definitely an example about this that you'll encounter this week. But could there be cases where consequentialism is going to tell us we should sacrifice the one to save the many? Like trolley problems, for example, where you pull the lever and one dies as a result of you pulling the lever, but 5 were saved. Well, what if that having to be the cause of that person's death, just that messes with someone's fundamental integrity? That they've built their life about caring about human life, and that killing someone is just terrible in their mind and their psychology, and yet consequentialism tells them, yeah, you need to pull a lever, kill the one to save the 5, and that person's like, but I can't still be me if I do that. Consequentialism is like, but morality demands that you do that, do the best by the most. And the person's like, but I just don't know. And consequentialism is like, what is there to know about? Do the best for the most. The numbers point you in the right direction. That person's like, but I just didn't know. And consequentialism is like, no, you got to do it. So you see how consequentialism is like sacrifice the one to save many and still be me. That's the way these integrity objections work, is that sometimes consequentialism may, in a sense, tell us that it's okay to do certain things that we do not think we could ever remain ourselves if we were to do. That could be the case of like torture 5 in order to save 100. And then consequentialism could say that in that case, you do what's best for the most, you go and torture. But the act of torturing someone can be more than certain individuals can stand, But yet consequentialism is saying that's what you should do. That's its result of its calculation. And then yet that person's like, but that just is contra to who I want to be in this life. So integrity objections can be pretty stout against consequentialism, but all it's going to say is that if you buy into the notion that doing the best for the most is what is to be the ultimate judge, then your integrity sometimes has to be sacrificed for the whole. That's how they'll respond to integrity objections, is that why are we caring about individual integrity? Once again, remember, it's about the good of the whole, the group, the affected bundle of people, not just you. So your personal integrity may matter a whole lot to you, but it may be something that has to be sacrificed for the good of the whole at times. That's how they're going to respond to integrity objections. Justice, human rights objections. Yeah, there's no reason that a consequentialist calculation couldn't at times result in things like You have 5 people that are dying. Each one of them needs another organ. Like one needs a heart, one needs a kidney, one needs a liver, on down the line. And then you have a healthy person that walks in the medical office and they don't want to volunteer their organs. They will die if you take their organs. But you could benefit 5 by killing one person and parting out their organs. Now, so that means it's like, don't people have a right not to be killed just to benefit the most? That's like that fundamental human right notion. And then consequentialists are going to be like, well, we would need to do the calculation. By doing that, by saying they'll need to do the calculation, that means that human, like, fundamental things that some people consider inalienable and fundamental rights, those things are on the table too. I mean, remember, rights imply like the individual has some uber duper claim against like the government or others. And consequentialism will give that stuff up if it doesn't benefit the most. So, they're not especially tied to any of these things that sometimes people feel so strongly about. Consequentialism is like, sometimes doing the best for the most may not be consistent with what people think they have rights to. So, they don't get to exercise their rights. The rights are not as important as always doing the best for the most. So that's how consequentialism is going to reply to like justice, human rights objections. It's going to be like, well, sometimes, even if a person has a right to do something, it doesn't mean that we should allow them to exercise that right. Like for example, say people got a permit and they're protesting, and that's okay. They're acting within their rights, their legal rights as a U.S. citizen to protest as long as it's peaceful demonstration, all that stuff. But then say that it's brought to the attention that, oh, here's some of these other folks show up at this peaceful protest, and now it's building all this fervor, so that, fervor and angst and yelling and hollering, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And then there could, and it's like it's boiling to the point where there could be this large scale riot. So what would law enforcement do in many cases, or they could do, or call in the National Guard? Yeah, they could call them in and break up the whole protest. People could get killed in that process, like trip, fall, be trampled by other people. Yeah, folks could die in order for law enforcement and city officials to prevent a large-scale riot where many, many more would die. And so the idea is, a person would have a right to protest or peacefully assemble and, and do these public demonstrations things. But the idea is just because they have that right to do that, that doesn't mean that they get to keep exercising it on and on, even if they're not the cause of the riotous, potential riot. That it's some other group that shows up that doesn't have a permit. Well, those who were working within their right to do that can be, that their ability to exercise that can be stopped prematurely in order to prevent a larger harm that really they did not cause the potential danger, but they suffer in their exercising of their right in order to prevent a larger danger. So it's like a preventative scenario. And some people, find that unappealing about consequentialism. And there's many other examples, but that's kind of how justice and human rights objections. And then contra-individualism, I've mentioned this many times with consequentialism, and some people find that very, very, very distasteful, that consequentialism doesn't give the individual or the I or the me a privileged place in moral decision making. It's kind of that more sterile science sort of way of looking at things. We look at the results, each counts as one and no more than one, count up the positives, the negatives, and then however those numbers come out, that's all that matters in terms of determining when a specific action is moral or immoral. And some people don't find that appealing. And then, so for the consequentialism, the individual, the few, doesn't ever matter as much as the many. That's another way to think about it. That it just does not matter as much as far as morality goes for consequentialism. But note that none of, and some people find that problematic. That's why it could be a potential weakness. Some people could perceive that as a very strength for consequentialism. But note that none of these potential weaknesses nor strengths are like definitive. It's like none of the weaknesses or objections completely defeat consequentialism. As long as consequentialists always have a response that seems reasonable, plausible, even if it's as long as they can always talk their way out of a counterexample and in a reasonable way, a decent way, then they're not defeated. But also that consequentialists could very well not be as strong as they like to think. Like there could be some true problems with what's taken to be their strengths. So one always has to think very carefully about it. Then one thing that's cool about consequentialism, because it is so straightforward, is you can always build consequentialist arguments for anything you want to. Like if you want to say that an action is moral, all you got to do is use this structure. That little 3 dots is just a conclusion symbol. You could use C here, but I just use the 3 dots. It's a sort of standard way to represent conclusions when you do an argument in this form. Is it's like, yeah, if action X, picks whatever you want. Say Sally's abortion. If Sally's abortion results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected by it, then it's moral. Then the next thing is, well, Sally's abortion did in fact result in the best overall consequences. Thus, Sally's abortion was moral. You could go just the same way. What these are is just structures that you can insert whatever action you're considering in these frameworks, and you generate immediate consequentialist arguments. This is how easy it is to generate consequentialist arguments. And then you can do it with a rule or a law. And if you want to do it with like immoral, it's just as easy. Like if action X does not result in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings, then it's immoral. Action X did not result in such things, so it was immoral. That's how easy it is to build consequentialist arguments. Now, how would you argue against a consequentialist argument like this? Well, premise 1 or reason 1 in all of these is just that core moral principle. This is just, premise 1 is just consequentialism. So in order to attack premise 1, if you wanted to upend an argument like this, you would need to you would need to hammer on consequentialism as a theory, beat on its weaknesses, argumentatively give lots and lots of reasons for why consequentialism is a very unappealing moral theory. That's how you kind of beat on premise 1 if you want to try to argue against the style reasoning. And then 2 is, well, this is just a statement of fact. This you'd have to test. That action X does not result in the best overall consequences. The only way you can do that is to do a consequentialist calculation. So it's like, in order to make headway against arguing against 1, you have to argue against, consequentialism. But in order to argue against 2, you actually have to assume consequentialism and do the calculation and then show consequentialist by your own way of calculating premise 2 or reason 2 is not true. So just think about that. You'll see that that's a really kind of neat way those arguments work. And we'll encounter these structures throughout the semester. That's why I present them now. Examples is like you can put in there like action X is Sally's abortion, or telling one friend about the partner that's cheating. Just make that action X, and then you can run through these and practice it and see how one would argue in a consequentialist way. Okay, at this point, we have said a lot of words about consequentialism and how to make sense of the notion of doing the best for the most and everything pretty much that one needs to have a decent handle on what's going on with the ethical moral theory called consequentialism. And remember that it answers these questions. That's what it's provided us with answers to. Is when is a specific action moral or immoral? Well, when that action results in the best for the most that are being affected by the action, then it's moral. When is it immoral? When it does not result, when it results in a net loss for the most affected by the action. And are there reliable ways to accurately make these types of determinations? Consequentialism says yes. The reliable way to make these determinations is to tally up the consequences. And we've talked about how that's done, and we've looked at the bar charts. But that's all that will be said about consequentialism for this week. But we can say a few things about the textbook readings. Comments about this week's textbook readings and videos. This week's readings from the textbook, you'll have an article by John Stuart Mill. You'll have another one by Poyman. And there were John Stuart Mill and Poyman are philosophy people writing for other philosophy people. That means they assumed a significant degree of background knowledge, that whoever their readers are, they would have a significant amount of background knowledge when they started reading their articles. Well, now, after having watched through this video and we've talked about consequentialism, notice that Mill and Poyman are going to talk about utilitarianism, which is just a form of consequentialism. As far as our purposes go, that's all it is. Consequentialism is the larger label, whereas utilitarianism is like inside consequentialism. So think about it like NFL football player and then a particular football player that plays for the Patriots or the 49ers or whatever. So all of those are NFL football players. They just happen to play for different teams. Well, that's the way utilitarian is. This one team amongst a lot of different consequentialism-based teams. So, but it's the more traditional historical one. And so that's Mill and Poyman. They'll be talking about the strengths. Essentially, both of their articles are trying to offer defenses for consequentialism. Poyman considers some objections to it and then responses. Mill does too, though. Mill, though, keep in mind, he was writing, 200 so years ago, so his way of putting words and sentences together may be a little difficult initially, but now that we've talked about consequentialism, it should be much, much easier for a person to read the Mill article than it would have been. And we can use our philosophical pattern of inquiry. You can use it and work your way through the Poyman and Mill articles. Remember, that's what that pattern of inquiry is for. Initially, well, what's the problem? What motivated Mill to write, this excerpt from a book entitled Utilitarianism? Well, his motivation is he wanted to make his theory seem as plausible as possible. That's why he wrote the book. And then the question is, for the whole book is utilitarianism a plausible moral theory, ethical theory? Mill, his answer is going to be, well, yeah, he wants you to think so. And then you can look and find, well, what kind of reasons does he offer to us to think that utilitarianism is plausible? Why would Mill want us to think it's a good theory, ethical theory? Why would he think we should want to use it in our everyday life? And remember, it's just a form of consequentialism. So, Poyman, what is his problem or his motivating agenda? Well, it's to demonstrate that utilitarianism and, in turn, consequentialism is not as naive or weak as some people think. He's trying to, he'll raise objections and then give a response. And he'll make a distinction, between act utilitarians and rule utilitarians. You've seen that in this video, that really there is a difference. That act utilitarians, they have a little different theoretical commitments than rule utilitarians do. But for our purposes, they're both consequentialists. So don't let it hang you up about which is which. You should know the difference. You may very well encounter a quiz question, maybe, that has something to do with that distinction. But typically, the main thing is focus on the big features of consequentialism as a whole. This just appointment article gives you a sense of that consequentialists are not. It's not a weak theory. It is a defensible theory, but it's not to say that it's perfect. As all theories, it has strengths, it has weaknesses. But that's kind of Poyman's motivating agenda, is to make utilitarianism look good, look better than it would otherwise look to certain people who want to object to it. And so I've given you another little prompt or two here. Hopefully that'll be that, or that should be enough to help one navigate those textbook readings. And then in terms of the other videos for this week, well, they're just trolley problems. They're versions of trolley problems with driverless cars, and that's relevant to this week's discussion, which everyone will check that out. And I don't need to say any comments, I don't think, about this week's discussions. It should be self-explanatory when you read the directions. But yeah, so trolley problems, we've already discussed it, and you'll get a chance to work with one in particular that's been mentioned in this video during this week's discussion. But I look forward to seeing what everybody comes up with on the discussions. And if you have any questions about anything in this video, definitely send me an email. Let me know. I'm always here to help. Until then.